Hello and welcome to the third Deaf Leadership Summit. My name is Chris Reed and Director of Operations with Sign Health. I'm really pleased to be hosting this webinar and introducing our main speaker, Jackie Driver. Now, the purpose of this webinar is to showcase the range of deaf people themselves as leaders, contributing their perspectives of what leadership means for them, and also their experiences of how they became leaders, and giving you the opportunity and myself to reflect on our own experiences, our leadership styles, as well as thinking about yours and my development in terms of improving our leadership for the future. So, looking at Jackie, who is she? She is based in Manchester, has the strategic commissioning lead within health and social care. She herself is heavily involved in local and national charity activities. For example, she is the chair of Sign Health, as well as chair of Breakthrough. As a person, she is widely recognized as an influencer, an advocate for disabled people's rights, women's rights, as well as the LGBT plus communities. She's also been awarded an OBE quite recently, so all credit to her. And like me, I'm sure you will be interested in Jackie's presentation. Now, over to you, Jackie.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you to Stuart and his team for the invite to this important event, and what a prestigious topic you've given me to address. I do hope that I can do it justice for you. The aims for today, I've opened with a picture of Niall DeMarco here, as I think he's a good inspiration for using what he has, and in his case, his looks, to raise his profile and personal drive as a deaf rights activist. His talents on screen have also enabled the wider world to better understand what unnecessary barriers we've created for deaf people and what it means to smaller marginalised groups. Staying true to your cause and raising the game on tackling inequalities is an important inspiration for me. Next slide, please, Stuart. So if we can move to the next slide. So the first question I had to ask myself was, why would I be approached as a leader? It made me question, am I a leader? What is a leader? What do you need to be a leader? What does it mean to be a leader? You know, should everyone be a leader? And it reminds me of a YouTube clip that I saw of a group of people outside on a sunny day by a river. One guy, who was a little too worse for wear with having drunk a lot, got up to do a dad dance to someone else's ghetto blaster. And at first, everyone stared at him, dismissed him, felt a little embarrassed for him. And then somebody decided to get up and dance with him. And that changed the whole scene. In psychology, that's called a first follower. And a first follower is much more important than a leader. And gradually, other people got up to dance, to the point where there were more people dancing than people sitting and watching. And those people sitting and watching felt a little uncomfortable that they weren't dancing. And I think that's a good analogy for what we term leadership. Leadership, you can't be a leader on your own. Leadership is about bringing people with you. And that for me was a useful example. Next slide, please. To tell you a little bit about my own story. Well, here I list some of the achievements that I've made. I've been lucky enough to secure jobs in areas that I'm passionate about: disability rights and equality, diversity and inclusion. Despite the barriers that I've faced in education and employment, I've persevered, sometimes against the odds, because of the passion for the work that I do is very high in me. I think that it matters. If you want it enough, you'll keep getting up when you're knocked down. And if you believe it enough, you'll strengthen your convictions, but it is hard to do it on your own. I show this picture as leaping into the unknown. That can feel quite scary, and all of your instincts tell you not to do it. But doing it, using your curiosity and exploring what's on the other side is an important part, I think, of leadership. Having the support and safe spaces within deaf and disabled organisations where I've volunteered helps me with my leadership skills because it helps me build my confidence as a leader out there. I don't think I could do it without those safety nets, those safe spaces of engaging with other deaf and disabled people. It's helped me be authentic and be the person that I am. Next slide, please. So a little bit about me and my lived experience. Does that matter? Well, of course, like most of us here today, I've had my doubts in myself. My parents were migrants to this country and they wanted to assimilate. They didn't want to stand out for obvious reasons. So exposing my deafness for them was a challenge. So they pretended I wasn't deaf at school. They gave me national health glasses and made me sit at the front of the class. Of course, that didn't work. But the school itself had me assessed and they sent me 2 days a week to a deaf school, 3 days a week to a mainstream school. And that was very challenging because I didn't fit in one place or the other. I left school without any qualifications and ended up finding my way into work. But that was also very challenging for me. At college, I didn't have any reasonable adjustments. At work, I missed information to do my job, which resulted in bullying at work. And in relationships and with friends, I didn't have access to things like the cinema and clubs and music. I felt left out. And of course, my healthcare, I was given hearing aids that didn't work for me, adaptations that didn't work for me. So always it was a challenge. So it was, you know, like everybody I know here will understand, it can be very wearing to keep having those day-to-day challenges. Next slide, please. So diverse leadership, it's now given that diverse leadership will pay. There's been a lot of research done in the last 5 to 10 years that shows that if you have diverse leadership, you will, as an organisation, profit. As a public body, you will do a better job of serving the public. Some 43% more likely to have profits if you've got diverse leadership. So where are all the deaf leaders? Why are we so underrepresented? Next slide, please. So we mostly all will recognise this picture sometimes as to how we feel. Some of us, we mostly, you know, see others gliding past us in our careers, taking out our hard work and ideas with ease to claim for themselves. Some of us have to work twice as hard just to stand still when we experience discrimination. But my message to you here is not to give up. You will move forward, small step by step. It's not a fair playing field, I agree, but don't let that be the thing that makes you give up. Create your own game if necessary. You know, these feelings, we must try and pass them to make good leaders. Next slide, please. So, are you a leader? That's my next question. Are you a leader? Do we want to be a leader? Do you have what it takes? Well, let's have a look and see what we can learn from others. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, motivating others towards a common goal. This will require you to inspire others, to influence others. So how do we do this? Well, team spirit is one of the things that's really, that leaders tell us is very important. One of the best ways in which you can encourage others to work towards the same goal, perhaps in the workplace, is a team spirit, an atmosphere where everyone works as part of a team. People are included, they're not left out. Many things can stand in the way of creating a team spirit, such as individuals that don't agree or get along. Failures have occurred, and individuals that don't necessarily may dislike each other. But we have to get past that, and we have to make sure we include people, even if we don't agree with them. And the second thing, I think, is persistence and persuasion. An excellent method of convincing people that they should work together to achieve the same goal is by convincing them that they'll all receive a reward for doing so, whether this be pride in their achievement or a physical reward. And you know, we don't often give physical rewards to individuals, but we do encourage people to work together by influencing them and leading them to believe that they will be rewarded emotionally or psychologically. So praising other people is a very important part of leadership. Next slide, please. So here I've just started to look at some of the leaders we already know. So here we have Mozzeria, which is a deaf-owned and led pizza shop in San Francisco. This organisation was created with the goal of providing customers a welcoming, memorable and visual environment to experience deaf culture whilst developing a business. It also encourages career placement opportunities for deaf people. So, you know, good on them. You can say they book the system, set their own rules and set up their own business. So they're good leaders. Another example of a good leader is Helga Stevens. Helga is a Flemish MP, member of the European Parliament from Belgium, who is deaf. She's been a politician since 2014. She's a strong advocate for deaf and disabled people's rights, and she uses her work role to further those rights. You know, so that's a really good example of a different type of leadership. There we also have pictures of Hermone and Herode Bahrain, the identical twin sisters from Eritrea, both models, again raising the profile of being deaf and successful. We've got Haben Girma there, first deafblind graduate of Harvard Law School, and of course she worked under Obama's rule in the USA. Other organisations which aren't on that list, of course, we've got Black Deaf UK, risen up in the last few years and raised the profile of intersectional discrimination and issues of racism within deaf communities. I also put on Tip Top Gardeners on there, so hardly leaders, you might think, but this is a small deaf business. They've again opted out of working for others and are working for themselves. If the system doesn't accept you, well, lead your own self if that's what you want. Make your own business, set your own standards and engagements for customers. Really good example there. And of course, Sign Health, the organisation that I chair. Our journey since I've been there is to make this a deaf-led organisation. Over 2/3 of our staff and board are now deaf, and we actively address lack of representation from communities who experience racism, and deaf leadership at senior levels is levelling up. We're very keen to model best practice in the charity sector and be a leader that evidences lived experience in its leadership. Next slide, please. So that takes me on to what makes a leader. And I offer some of the skills and ways that leaders have shared, particularly deaf leaders have shared. So here, of course, a picture of the late Jack Ashley, who was a long-time campaigner for deaf and disability rights, at a time when there was very little understanding of autism and disability discrimination. So being a team player, the message here is you can't go it alone as a leader. Remember the drunk guy example, you need to bring people with you and actively listen to those who want to influence so that you can address their priorities and their agendas. Lead from where you are. This really speaks to being authentic. Don't try and be someone you're not. You might appear different from others that you're influencing, but there's no need to try and emulate them. Be yourself. Use preferred forms of communication and don't be shy to ensure you have the most comfortable environment in which to communicate. All of us here, I'm sure, will be used to having to manage that kind of situation. Of course, you'll have a topic area you'll feel comfortable to talk about, but don't limit yourself. A leader has to respond in any given situation. So, you know, think about understanding other people's agendas, understanding the issues that you face, asking questions, being inquisitive. Receiving feedback, of course, is important. Leaders receive criticism and you'll find a way to receive that and learn from it. They're not usually direct attacks on you as a person, but try and deflect that and develop how you make your decisions. Be humble. We all learn by getting things wrong sometimes, and accept that. Show you understand the issues raised with you, communicate well. That's something deaf people are very good at doing. We have to communicate in other people's forums far too often. And lastly, of course, think about whether your decisions reflect your own interests, and if they do, declare it. Honesty and integrity are really important aspects, I think, of leadership. Next slide, please. Of course, many of the key things required for leaders will be familiar to deaf people. Cultural identity is an important aspect of authenticity. Talking about your lived experience is an important element of senior leadership. Diversity of thought is hugely better than single-minded views. And using our own cultural lens will be important. We need to showcase diverse leadership, not try and be something that we're not. Next slide, please. But of course, it can be difficult if you're on your own. Who will support you? How will you convince others? Well, consider asking yourself these questions. This is what deaf leaders have said works for them. What do I need to do to position myself in this situation? What are my challenges and barriers at this time? What are my strengths? Is this a good time to try and aggressively position myself? Should I choose my battles? Is this audience ready to open the door to me, to be influenced by me? And, you know, was there a cultural or linguistic disconnect? Do I need to say something in a different way to try and reach people? They're the kind of things that deaf leaders have told us are important to them. Finally, I just wanted to finish on some success stories. We've had breakthroughs and successes in recognising deaf culture. The 2003 recognition of British Sign Language felt like a breakthrough at that time, but it was badly followed up. So no real sustainable funding to make it happen. Scotland were bold in developing the BSL Act. We need something similar in England and Wales. We see Lynn Stewart Taylor's campaign has received traction, particularly useful to point to the lack of interpreters during the pandemic. Other campaigns have been successful because of good leadership, including the legal challenge to subtitle TV, accessible jury service, first language trauma counsellors, accessible education, and so on. So we're a small community, We need to join forces to ensure that we work closely together across deaf organisations to make our bids for equality. We're too small to do it alone. Thank you.
Jackie, thank you very much. An incredibly interesting presentation, lots of food for thought. I would be interested to hear, I mean, it was interesting to hear your perspective on leadership and your own experiences of what it is that you have been through. So that was good to know. Now, I would like to ask our audience, please use the Q&A facility if you have any questions to ask. Now, I do have a question, and the first question that I would like to ask is, what advice would you give to anyone to go into a leadership position for the first time?
Of course, thank you, Chris. That's a good question. My first thing is stay calm, don't panic, and don't think it's not for you. Leadership is just a way of being. It doesn't require any skills you don't already have. It just requires a bit of practice. A lot of people who have become leaders can look the same, but that is only because some people already have a lot of privilege and can both increase their confidence as a leader and increase others' expectations that they'll make a good leader. Our Prime Minister is a good example. He knew he was going to be a Prime Minister as a young child, but that's only a result of privilege, not skills he possessed, because he didn't possess those skills as a child. Being white, hearing, male, etc., isn't something you have to be a good leader. In fact, experiencing adversity is a great skill for a leader, something that will make others see that you're authentic. You won't have a lot of role models like Boris Johnson has, but don't let that put you off. We need more deaf role models, and you could become one of these.
Jackie, thank you. Now, reflecting on your past experiences of growing up and going through the different job positions that you had, when was it that you became decisive about, I am going to become a leader? So looking back, at what point did you decide, yes, I want to be in a leadership position?
A very interesting question there, Chris. And really, like most people, I don't really think of myself as a leader in the traditional sense. I think a leader is someone who can see how things can be improved and who rallies people to move towards that vision. Leaders can work towards making their vision a reality whilst putting people first. Just being able to motivate people isn't enough. Leaders need to be empathetic and connect with other people to be successful. Looking back, I think here's a good example. I think I first thought of myself as a leader. Many years ago, I witnessed a motorbike accident. Lots of people were present. It was outside a college where students were leaving for the day. Many people were milling around, and a car went straight into a motorbike. And it was like everything stood still. I was crossing the road with a friend. Everybody else stood still while I was walking towards the injured person. I approached him to see if I could help. And for a very long minute, nobody else did anything. I reached him and asked him to stay still. I turned to my friend and asked her to call 999. I then saw a bus coming around the corner, so I directed a bystander to ask the bus driver and traffic to halt and to move and make way for the ambulance to arrive. I then called out for anyone with medical skills, and of course other people started coming then and joining. I didn't know I was going to do all that. I haven't got any medical qualifications, but in fact, what I was doing was being a leader. I was taking responsibility in a situation to delegate, to support, and to manage a difficult situation. So leadership, I think, is about just taking personal responsibility. It doesn't require anything other than that, really.
Thank you, Jackie. Throughout your presentation, you used the strength in words such as persevering, persuasion. Those skills are not that easy to use as a deaf person. It is difficult to challenge a hearing person and to persevere with them. Would you agree that as a deaf person, they have to try harder to persuade and to show leadership? Would you agree with that point of view?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's an experience that's replicated for other people who experience discrimination in different ways. There's a term that's used in race discrimination called weathering. And what I think weathering is a very good term for capturing the day-to-day constant small microaggressions that people who experience discrimination can face day in, day out. It's cumulative. It builds and builds and builds in us until we feel like our head can explode. And sometimes you've just had enough and the next person can tip you over and you can just get angry and just want to walk away. And so, yes, Chris, I agree. It is very, very difficult when you are trying to deal with the world that really has sidelined you and not included you. And for me, that's a drive. For me, that's a passion to continue in the area of work that I'm passionate about, which is equalities and fairness and giving people a level playing field. So yes, I agree. It is a very, very big challenge to persuade people and to encourage and to engage people when they just think you're going to cost more because you need an interpreter, or you're going to take more time because you use an interpreter, or because you use hearing aids, or whatever the reasonable adjustment that you require is. But you know, the law has been fought for long and hard to make reasonable adjustments real. It doesn't work in practice. We know it doesn't work in practice. That's why Sign Health, my organisation that I chair, calls for a British Sign Language Act to be effective and to give people, deaf people, the rights that they should be afforded in society. And it's a passion for mine that I continue to fight for and will continue to fight for throughout my life, because this is difficult and it's hard for deaf people. But my answer is also that hearing people are missing out. They're missing out on that wide talent pool of deaf people. They're missing out on engaging them in employment. They're missing out on engaging them on leadership, on political representation, and in other walks of life. So, you know, we're all losing. And the point is, if we're all losing, how do we move forward to being a much more inclusive society?
Thank you. I'm just looking at the question and answers that are coming from the audience. One question that is being asked is, what tips would you have for a deaf leader that is within a mostly hearing organization? So a deaf leader within a hearing organisation, what tips would you give to them?
That's a very good question, and most of us are in hearing organisations. There are very few deaf-led organisations, and many deaf people do strive to work in them because it's easier. Communication is easier, engagement is easier, you feel more comfortable, etc. But that's not a reality for most of us. Most of us have to work in a hearing world where we're excluded in so many different ways. So my own journey has been to, obviously, to drive equality. And so, you know, I've had to constantly reinvent the wheel and keep knocking on those doors and trying to get those doors open a little bit on understanding and addressing autism and deaf discrimination. It depends on the organisation that you work for and what their purpose is. But for me, most of my work has been in the public sector. So one of my biggest tools, if you like, is that the public sector are there to deliver services to the public. And that includes deaf people. And I think public servants today have forgotten to be public servants. They just continue to deliver the same services, making a few changes here and there when they get budget cuts, without recognising that there's historically structural inequalities built into the way they deliver their services. So when it comes to the deaf person that's asking for an interpreter with a hospital appointment or on a jury service or wherever in public service, they see it as a problem because they haven't previously put the solutions in place. So when it becomes a problem in public service, they put it in the hard to do box. So my job is to tell them to take it out of that hard to do box for two reasons. One, it's not hard to do. And two, they're there to serve the public. They've got, each and every public servant has a public sector equality duty. And that means everyone from the chief execs through to the admins and the cleaners and the people that leave the boxes of photocopying paper in the accessible toilets. Everybody has to think about who the public is, and nobody is one-dimensional. We have deaf public who experience discrimination. We have Black and minority ethnic community public who experience discrimination. We have lesbians, gay men, bisexual people who experience discrimination. Lots and lots of communities who experience discrimination. So my working in public service, joining together with other equality groups has been a great source of power and support for me. Focusing on discrimination and disadvantage has been a great support for me because working together with others has been more powerful than working alone.
Agreed. The importance of working together is important. Okay, another great question. What role do you think that current deaf leaders should play in developing future deaf leaders? Those to give them the power. So what is it that current deaf leaders do to encourage others to become deaf leaders of the future? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you, Chris. I think that is another great question. I agree. So there's lots of things that deaf leaders can do. If we go back to the slide of all the different types of leadership that I suggested that you could think of, from business owners to politicians to people in all walks of life, I think every deaf leader can be a role model. And often we're shy to be role models. When I was approached to come and talk to this group here, I thought, well, who would want to listen to me? You know, because we all think that. But actually, there's a responsibility on as leaders. And last year when I received the OBE, I realised that that meant for me a responsibility to support others. You don't close the door behind you when you climb up the steps of a ladder. You widen the access and you encourage others to come and join you, and that's the whole point. For me, there was no point being the only person in the House of Lords or the only person on a senior board. You know, it's tokenistic if you are the only deaf person there, and it's also a very lonely place. The whole point is, if you have reached somewhere, start to think about how you can dismantle the barriers that you've experienced to help others along the way. And that might mean that you offer to mentor other deaf people. I've done a lot of mentoring of deaf people in the public service, in the civil service. It might mean that you offer to coach deaf people in very particular situations. If somebody's got a job interview and they're anxious or nervous about it, you could do that. It might mean, for me, one of the things that's really missing is deaf political leadership in public life. Until we've got more politicians, we do have some, you know, good deaf politicians, but until we have more representation in those decision-making political environments that will make the changes that we're asking, which are just, you know, we're not asking for massive difference here. We're asking for equity and, you know, parity. We need more political leadership. We need more access to elected office. You know, we need to ensure that deaf people get the opportunity to get interpreters paid for and reasonable adjustments in place so that they can enter into public office. And in our legal institutions as well. I think those are two key areas where we need more representation of deaf people.
The point that you have raised about deaf politicians, yes, we do need to see more of that, and it would make a difference too. Now, I have been considering that question a lot because that applies to my role as well. And within Sign Health, we do have a lot of deaf employees, and I'm often approached about what management opportunities can I have. Now, they are frustrated because there is no accessible management courses, so that's a problem. And also reaching that glass ceiling. They don't have those opportunities to promote further. So I have considered and explored and working with other deaf organisations that are in a similar position to come together to think about developing and offering joint training opportunities for deaf staff who want to become managers. What do you think about that approach?
I think that's a really good call, and I'm afraid it is incumbent upon us as deaf people who have reached a particular level to do the hard work to make that happen, because others won't see it. A lot of hearing people don't see the barriers, the significance of the barriers that deaf people face. They'll see an interpreter, they'll see something on TV, and they'll think everything's all right. Occasionally they'll say, you know, they've seen the Where is the Interpreter campaign and thought, oh, something's wrong here. But mostly deaf people, mostly hearing people go about thinking that everything's all right with deaf people. And of course, we know it's not. So it's incumbent on us deaf people who have reached a level to start to raise the issue. And Chris, that's a really good call. One of the other things I think is really good is, you know, for deaf people who haven't got the skills to go straight into elected office, you know, have you thought about joining a school board, your children's school board? Have you thought about joining, you know, how can we support you to get the right skills so that you're confident addressing in public and raising issues of political importance? There are lots of ways of doing that, and I think, Chris, your suggestion of deaf organisations getting together is a really strong one, because you know, many of our deaf organisations are splintered. they'll be focused on education or employment or health, but actually working together, we could give each other opportunities to shadow and mentor across organisations to build confidence and to build skills and experience.
Thank you. One of the questions that we've been asked. Now, for people that have been through their own career, they have reached that glass ceiling. Yes, they've reached the glass ceiling. Now, what is your advice based on your personal experience? How do you smash that glass ceiling for deaf people?
Yes, a very good question. And I don't think there is one single answer to this. It requires a great deal of tenacity. In my career, particularly younger and also in my education, I learned a lot. So I moved around the country a lot when I was a child because my parents moved. And every time I moved, they kept putting me in the bottom class because automatically they said, well, she can't hear, she's not going to be very clever, let's put her at the bottom. And every time I was at the bottom and moved up, we moved schools, and then again I was put back in the bottom. And I think my experience of that has helped make me determined to fight my case that I am good enough. It's very hard because when you face discrimination, you often experience feeling not good enough. And discrimination works in very profound ways. And even though we know it happens to us, we absorb it as much as everybody else around us. So we self-perpetuate discrimination sometimes. So having a strong belief in yourself and being very consistent and persistent, I think, are two things that have helped me in my career. When I've been overlooked for a promotion, when I've been pushed aside to do an interesting piece of work or to be involved in something, I have challenged in a polite way, but I've challenged and I've said, well, these are the skills that I've got to offer. Why are you not taking them up? And sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. But I have probably been for more job interviews than the average person, I can tell you that. I've been for many jobs and not been shortlisted, not been appointed. I stopped putting my reasonable adjustments on my job application forms. I started getting more interviews. So therein lies a problem because, of course, you may want an interpreter for interview, but I think if you leave that to the last minute, at least if you get the opportunity for interview, then you can move forward a little bit. So I think persistence and consistency are two of the things that have helped me, but I think everyone has different journeys to make.
That's great. Another question. And this question always interests me. So how do deaf managers manage within a hearing organization? It's always interesting because it's a communication strategy, technical, how to communicate with hearing colleagues. So I'm interested in your experience, in your current position. What strategies do you use with your hearing colleagues?
Sure. First of all, I want to make the distinction between management and leadership because we know they are two different things. But being a manager, and I've been a manager of people now for the most part of my latter career, so probably for about 20 years I've managed people. And in a way, it's been a benefit to me. Because when you're a manager, you get to bring people together, allocate work, and manage a program or a project, manage a team. And when you manage a team, you've got some power over how that team will work together. So my very first experience of management of people was quite challenging, because of course I came in, I talked about the reasonable adjustments I needed, and of course all the other people in the room, and this was a new organisation, so it was new people coming together, felt confused by what I was asking for. That I use Palantype in work, so and I use access to work to pay for that Palantype. So of course things have to be booked in advance. So the first person, who was the admin person, had to book the Palantype for me, and they were saying, "Well, will I have to do this every time?" And I was saying, "Well, yes, I'm deaf every day. I'm not just deaf on a Tuesday. Of course, I need it every time." And so we had to start a new way of getting to work. So learning from that experience, when I manage new teams now, I do a little bit of an explainer for them. I explain about reasonable adjustments and why they're important. I explain about my own requirements. I encourage others to come forward to tell me about their requirements. And there might not be disability or deaf related. There might be other reasons. For example, a colleague might need to pray on a Friday morning and can't join a meeting at 11 o'clock on a Friday. Another colleague might need to have a break in a meeting because they're taking insulin. You know, there might be different reasons that people need different reasonable adjustments. So I try and put it, and this goes back to the leadership point, I try and explain things in other people's language, the narrative and the context that they're used to, and help them understand that for them, they might need this. For me, I might require that. And that helps. And generally, you do get people, you bring the first people that I bring along are the women that need flexible working, the colleagues that have got religious requirements, the colleagues that have got language requirements. Those are the people that need something but don't like to stand out and say so. So being a manager can help you set the environment and can help you set the culture and the context that you want your team to work in. When you're not a manager, that's of course more difficult to do. So management can be an asset.
Great, thank you. Through your presentation, you spoke about the success stories, such as BSL recognition. What do you think will be the next big success story that is needed for the deaf community?
Of course, it's a very good point. For me, the next story, I've touched on this already, but it needs to be shame. Shame on a government who ignore the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People. Despite being recognised in 2003 by the UK government as an official language, BSL is yet to be granted any form of legal status. In spite of the BSL Scotland Act and other language acts, there currently fails to exist BSL equality and accessibility legislation that covers the whole of the United Kingdom. There are over 150,000 BSL users in the UK, around 87,000 of whom are deaf and use British Sign Language as their first language. And for children who are born profoundly deaf, often English is a second language, is desperately needed to make BSL an official language in the UK. To establish a board to promote and facilitate the use of British Sign Language, and to state principles to guide the operations of bodies that provide public service, and to require bodies to promote and facilitate the use of British Sign Language. For me, you know, British Sign Language today is no longer something strange and peculiar to the hearing world. They all understand it, they all see it, they've seen it across the world throughout the pandemic. being used, on platforms, and embarrassingly, seen the lack of it here in one of the most wealthiest Western countries. Generally, there are too many concerns people have got in their lives to make deaf equality a priority for all. So we have to spell it out for them. We have to spell out what's needed, why, and what it will bring, so we can bring them 100% behind us. We need to bring them on board with plain and simple facts. And that's where I talked before about working in partnership, working together. Deaf organisations that are splintered won't make as big a difference as deaf organisations that work together on one common aim. The Where the Interpreter campaign is a really good example of plain, simple facts that everyone can understand and get communities behind you. It won't happen because we're too small a community to focus too much on a campaign on health here or education there or employment here. We need to have one single focus. Whilst we still do that important work in those areas, we need to have one single focus. And for me, it's British Sign Language Act.
Also, linked to that, to what you've just said about having more deaf people as politicians, to be involved with the minority groupings, to make that difference, to change policies. So you spoke about the UN Convention and the grouping. So getting deaf people actively involved in those, getting deaf people involved in national bodies to lobby, so that there is a bigger deaf voice. Now, to think about a deaf signing MP, think about the powerful image that that would create, and that other MPs would listen, and that would enable the BSL Act to come into force. What do you think about that approach?
I think that's really important, but we have to be careful. So if you think of Helga Stevens or Jack Ashley, there's an awful lot of weight on those shoulders to get it right. You can't do it alone. And whilst it's important that we have that representation, it's important that we also grow up from the grassroots. So, helping deaf people get involved in trade unions, helping deaf people get involved on school boards, helping deaf people get involved in local health boards, all of that will give deaf people the skills, the confidence, and the ability to rise into that political arena. It's very hard even to get into a political party as a deaf person, as some of our deaf colleagues will tell us. Barriers here, barriers there, barriers, we'll still face the barriers at trade unions, we still face the barriers at schools and so on and so forth, but helping break those glass ceilings will enable us to rise up and bring together a wealth of deaf political skill sets to get into those, to get into the Houses of Parliament, to get into our local police and crime commissioners, to get into our local government and local parties and members and councils. This is the important thing that we do, and we see a lot now of devolution. So we see a lot of power now going to the regions. So maybe that's an area that we could focus on to get deaf people represented at regional level, where those very important decisions are being made about localities and health and care and education and so on, as well as the Houses of Parliament. But to be sure, let's not try and put too much pressure on single deaf people being the only answer. We need to have more deaf people there. They need to have allies. Very hard to be that lone voice, I think.
You're right. You're absolutely right. I think we can take one or two more questions before we close the session. So another question. When you look at the role models out there, which ones inspire you? Those existing role models that are out there, who inspire you?
Yes, it's a good question. I'm inspired by all manner of role models. I'm not interested in closeness to power. I'm interested in people who will overcome a variety of different barriers. I'm particularly interested at the moment in the rise of Black Deaf UK. I think that's a really important organisation. It's honest and it's authentic, and it's talking about the issues that are very pertinent to experiencing what's known as intersectional discrimination. And I think that's really important. As deaf people, we're not immune to discriminating others. We need to be aware of that, and we need to be challenging that, and we need to be anti-racist in our thoughts and ways of being. And similarly for deaf women, you know, who also face different types of discrimination, it's very important for me to see that those people get the opportunity to get heard. I'm also very interested in young people who are very focused on addressing the really devastating effects of the climate change, because we can be fighting for a fair world, but only if that world still exists.
Great. I think we're going to finish with one more question. And I think it's a perfect one to end with. Now, you have had a very interesting career journey. Now, has your next ambition, would you like to become a politician? To prove that you can change the lives of deaf people?
It is a very interesting question, and it's not the first time I've been asked that. I feel a bit weary at the thought of politics. However, I am 60 this year. I'm due to retire from my job. I will never give up the fight for advancing equalities and human rights. And so maybe that is the next avenue for me. I don't know. I'll be very happy to continue to involve this work. Who knows?
All of this has been lovely. Thank you so much for your presentation, your extensive information, and I'm sure the audience feels the same. You've given us a lot of thinking on this, a lot to take away. Thank you for your time today. And I would also like to thank our audience member. I hope you found this useful as well. And I think this session will be available on YouTube so that you can watch it again. So we're now drawing this session to a close, and we're now going to show a video of what is planned for the next webinar session. And on that note, thank you all.